Okay, so now we're going to do the second part of the chapter. I would suggest that if you have not already, that you stop right now and print out the chapter 2 lecture words. All these words are going to be heard during the lecture, but I want to take the time at the end of the lecture to go over each one with you because you will hear them as either answers to questions or in the question itself. That being said, we're going to continue with the beginnings of English America. We touched on the fact that tobacco had saved a Virginia colony, and King James thought it was a terribly harmful habit to humans. But many not only enjoyed it, were beginning to think that it was perhaps healthful. And we had some people who thought that in the 20th century also. But Virginia's tobacco became their gold. It had saved their crops. It had saved their colony. And even though King James didn't like it personally, he was not adverse to, shall we say, benefiting from the taxes from it. And of course, there was a rush from the immigrants to gain land to grow tobacco because it required really very little land to grow on, and it didn't require that many people to work it. A very few men who arrived got the best land, and they would become the aristocracy of Virginia. In 1619, after having complained, the people of Virginia managed to talk the Crown into letting them have an elected assembly. So the House of Burgesses was the first elected assembly in the new colonies. And by 1700, Virginia had a population of over 90,000 people. But the men outnumbered the women 5 to 1. In 1620, they brought a boatload of women over they called tobacco brides because they went to the Virginia area, primarily to the people who owned tobacco plantations and became indentured servants. But the high death rate, combined with having to complete their indenture, women were usually late married and beginning their families. And unfortunately, the patriotic rule was difficult. But that's the way it was in those days. And husbands sometimes died before the children were raised, which left a widow. Well, a widow was entitled to 1/3 of her husband's property. And if a widow dies, her former husband's male heirs inherit. But there is two words, femme sole, which is a French word meaning a woman alone, predominantly in the South, where if a woman was alone, she had no husband, she could own or even manage her own property. And while most women did come over as indentures, they lived a very hard, abusive life. Meanwhile, as we mentioned in the last lecture, the Protestants who had left England under Bloody Mary, known as Marian exiles, came back as Puritans when King James became king. Now, their beliefs, they believed that the Church of England was too Catholic. There was too many statues, too much ritual, and that the priest should be able to marry, which is a big debate even today. And those elaborate ceremonies were just a vestige of the popery, which we didn't want. And furthermore, they believed that the congregation should choose the clergyman, not the Pope. We call them Puritans, but in reality, that wasn't what they were called in the beginning. They were called Congregationalists, and what they wanted to do was purify the Anglican Church. Puritan man, Puritan woman, the women had their hair covered and everything else. The Puritans hated Catholicism, and they urged believers to see the truth through the Bible. Now, they were followers of a man called John Calvin from Scotland, who believed in, predestination. Your followers were either elect saints or you were damned, and God decided before you were born whether you were going to go to heaven or hell, and nothing you did would change God's mind. But if you led a good life and you were healthy and you were prosperous, it was a pretty good indication that you might be one of the elected few that God has already chosen. Which leads you to the discussion, if it doesn't matter what you do because God's already made up his mind, what difference does it make what you do? Now we're going to get just a bit away from the text, and we're going to settle all the original colonies at one time, which your text does not. Now, it would bode well for you to know something about each colony. So if you've got a piece of paper handy, I'll give you time to write down the name of the colonies. The New England colonies. The Virginia Company in England had agreed to let a group of pilgrims settle, even though they were obnoxious. Now, the pilgrims were a radical sect of Puritans, and they were separatists. They believed that they were God's chosen, and everyone else was going to hell. They were persecuted severely in England, so they left to go to Holland. Well, unfortunately, Holland was a very, I'm trying to think of the word to use, very modern, very cosmopolitan, and they believed in letting you do pretty much what you wanted to do and whatever religion you wanted. And although they were still poor, their children were drifting away, further away from their beliefs. So they decided to migrate to the New World. And they found a ship called the Mayflower, incidentally. And as they were coming to the New World, they were supposed to land in Northern Virginia. But through an accident, they ended up landing up around what we all call the Massachusetts area, in a place they're going to call Plymouth in 1620. So the Pilgrims, which they were not known as Pilgrims, and they were known as Separatists, but they wanted to leave the church because it couldn't be purified, and they landed in a place called Plymouth in 1620. So you've got the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Pilgrims were non-separatists, they wanted to purify. Pilgrims were separatists and wanted to leave the church. Now, this Mayflower Compact that you heard about, and maybe you've even heard it was the first constitution in this country, it was not. It was not a consensus or a constitution. It was just a concept agreed on. They agreed to obey the laws, and just a few of the men did. It was not majority rule. It was a self-rule. And after the first bad winter, no one returned. That's one thing you can say for them. They were very stubborn and stick-to-itive. They engaged in the fur trade, they mastered the hotel frontier, they created government, they erected churches, and they repaid their English backers. And if it hadn't been for the good help from the Indians, they would never have made it. But they were a very small sect. William Bradford, a name you do need to remember, was a yeoman in Yorkshire, England. Now, in case you don't know, yeoman just means a landowning farmer, a small landowning farmer. And he'd expressed his, shall we say, nonconformist religious sensibilities in his early teens and joined the famed separatist church at the age of 17. He also came to the New World and wound up being the governor of Plymouth, and he served 31 years as the governor of the colony. Now, there's a difference between the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony. The Massachusetts Bay colony was settled by what we call non-separatists, or in other words, the Reformed Calvinists or the Puritans. King James didn't want the Church of England's doctrine contaminated, and he hated the Puritans. He persecuted them unmercifully. One of his favorite things to do was take a Puritan and tie him to a tree and stick a nail through his tongue so he couldn't eat or drink, and he'd just die. The Puritans heard, and you notice I've got that in quotation marks, they heard the king was going to try to get rid of all of them. So they decided to migrate to the New World, and it was called the Great Migration, when tens of thousands left in the decade between 1630 and 1640. So the Great Migration is when the Puritans came to the New World and landed in the Massachusetts Bay. Now, they were a lot, I guess you'd say, superior to the Pilgrims because they came in family units. They managed to survive. They created a community dedicated to the glorification of God, and a city on the hill was going to shine out to everyone. They were smart. They took their charter with them, and they converted their charter to frame the work of the government. But there again, this is not democracy in action, because only free men could vote, and there was only a few of them. They were totally intolerant of dissenters. If you were a Quaker or a Baptist or something else, a Catholic, you were not welcomed in their colony. They were self-appointed saints, and they would sometimes not just, shall we say, kick you out of the colony, they would execute you. John Winthrop, a very wealthy Puritan lawyer, was one of the leading figures in the founding of their colony, and he served 12 annual terms as governor, although not consecutive. He opposed unconstrained democracy. He thought there should be some rich, there should be some poor. It was God's way. So you've got Bradford, who's in charge of the Plymouth Bay. You've got Winthrop in charge of the Massachusetts Bay. But everybody didn't agree with their ideas. Now, for instance, one of the most famous people who did not agree was Roger Williams. He was a minister. He graduated at Cambridge University in London. Very intelligent man, and he was welcomed when he first came over because he was a Puritan minister. But he had some rather wild ideas. He said the civil authority had no right to judge on religious matters. And it's misspelled. It's not match. It's supposed to be matters, which is a separation of church and state. That's exactly what he wanted. He said we shouldn't just take the land from the Indians. We should buy it from them. And oh, the one that got him into the most trouble was women should have some rights. Well, it didn't take long before he was banished from the colony. So he left Massachusetts and went south and set up a refuge for dissenters. He named his little area Providence. In 1643, he managed to talk, shall we say, the lords-to-be in England to grant the independence colony and call it Rhode Island. So now we have 3 colonies. You've got the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you've got Plymouth Colony, and you've got the colony of Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson was another one that was a dissenter. She had followed Cotton Mather from England over because she was a good Puritan. Very strong-willed, well-educated woman in theology, which is extremely unusual. In 1634, she arrives in Boston and didn't like what she was seeing, so she began hosting religious discussions weekly in her home. She was a nonconformist, and she did not attend regular services or even dress modestly. She stressed direct communication with God. You don't have to go through these priests or the ministers or the lay people of the church. You can talk to God yourself. As God declares his anarchy, he's the boss. You should be able to talk to him. Well, she was labored in Antominian, because she was preaching against the Puritan ways. Her followers grew. They got so strong they even voted Governor Winford out of office. Well, that wasn't going to last long. His followers got together and fought back and got him reelected the next time around. And they arrested her and held a trial for her contempt and sedition. Well, she was doing pretty good, although she was 9 months pregnant at the time. She was standing up, defending herself, and was doing so well, and her judges were just lost because she was so well-versed in theology that she had an answer for everything he said. And they asked her, why do you think this way? Why? And she said the words that condemned her out of her own mouth. God spoke to me. Well, in the first place, God doesn't speak to women, right? It just wouldn't do. He would speak to a leader of the church, but not to a lowly woman. So she was banished. First, she went to a Dutch settlement along the Hudson River. And she joined Mr. Williams for a while, and then she went on to this Dutch settlement. Now, we have found out since that some of the Indians that killed her, massacred her and her family, were in the hire of church officials from Boston. They've never admitted it, but there's been documentation to prove that the leaders of the churches in Boston had their fingers in the kitty. So Puritan's legacy is secular, not spiritual, because these God-fearing people metamorphosed from the Puritan to a Yankee merchant. And if you're not familiar with Yankee trader or Philadelphia lawyer, these are old expressions for people who get things done by hook or by crook. The bad thing about them, other than being good businessmen, is that they believed in devils and held witch trials. They held blue laws. Maybe you've heard the term blue laws, and since we're not in class, I can't ask you, do you know what a blue law is? A blue law is basically a law, for instance, up until just a few decades ago, Wally World couldn't open until after church services, couldn't open until 12:30. Grocery stores couldn't open. Nothing could open until after time for church. And the reason they're called blue laws is because back in the days when the Puritans and everybody were writing the laws, they used to write things down on parchment, and they always wrote laws pertaining anything to do with religion on blue vellum. So therefore, blue laws came to be known as the religious laws. Very strict moral imperatives. But they had a practical contribution. They were good businessmen. They taught us how to be good Yankee merchants. They started Harvard College. They introduced the first printing press, and they had an emphasis on education. And your family could be imprisoned if you didn't teach your children how to read, because they thought everyone should be educated enough to be able to read the Bible. And their government is a theocracy. And there's one of the words on your, you've got three words. You've got oligarchy, theocracy, and aristocrats. Oligarchy is when the government is run by a few rich. Theocracy is when the government is run by religion or by religious leaders. It's always been said that our government is an oligarchy because all of our people, our presidents, are always very rich, it seems like. So Rhode Island is founded by Roger Williams in 1643, and there he said that people would have complete religious freedom. So you've got Massachusetts, and now you've got Rhode Island. Thomas Hooker founded the area called Hartford. Hartford's in Connecticut. He was in the fur trade business, and they left Boston because they couldn't get along with the religious leaders. There was too much theocracy for them. They wrote the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which became the first constitution written in the colonies. So Connecticut's known for writing the first constitution. Rhode Island can be known for the complete religious freedom. New Hampshire and Maine. Now, two men named Georges and Mason got a patent from the king for the region just north of Massachusetts. Mr. Georges took a region next to the coast, which would later become Maine. Mason took the westward part of it, and it would become New Hampshire. But both of these colonies for many years looked to Massachusetts for the government, and finally they were taken over for a time by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1679, King Charles II made New Hampshire a separate royal colony, and Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820, and then Maine would become a state, I think it's 1880. Vermont did exist, no, it wasn't 1880, 1780. Vermont did not exist as a chartered colony. It was part of New York until 1791, and then it became a state. The New England Confederation was formed in 1643 by the king to supposedly join Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven. They were supposed to get together and meet and really determine Indian policy. They did not invite Rhode Island because Rhode Island was dissenters. They did not get along, and the people from Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven, none of them wanted to let anybody else do anything. They wanted to be the leader. They wanted to all be chiefs and have no Indians, so to speak. So it was a very ineffective confederation and never got anything done. We've already discussed Virginia Company in Jamestown, which was the first successful colony from England in North America. Maryland. Sir George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, got a grant from King James to found a refuge for English Catholics. He was Catholic. He died, and his son Cecilius inherited the charter, and he's the one that made the first settlement called St. Mary's. And it did prosper because it looked down, it was a tobacco colony, and it looked down to Jamestown and saw the mistakes that they had made and was determined not to make them. The problem was the colony got so successful that before you know it, you had more Protestants than you had Catholics, and we started having problems between the Protestants and the Catholics because they did not get along. It was run like an old English feudal system, and the government and the councilor were elected assemblies. In 1649, they had to pass the Toleration Act to protect the now minority Catholics. You had freedom of worship only if you believed in the divinity of Christ, and of course, like I said, they were a tobacco-growing colony. It started out as a refuge for Catholics. It got to be more Protestants and more successful than they had anticipated, and the Catholics became very minor. Although I think even today it's considered a Catholic state. The Carolinas. Carolina English version of Carlos, which is French, or Prince Charles. That's who it was really named after, the French king, not the English king. But Charles II of England granted 8 of his loyal friends land south of Virginia, and they established Charlestown in 1670. It was actually the sons of the wealthy plantation owners on the islands, and what they were looking for was a place to grow groceries. The more of the islands they could put into sugar cane, the more money they would make. They didn't want to take the time and the effort to grow their own vegetables, so this was the whole idea. In the beginning, it had nothing to do with growing rice. They asked John Locke to form a government, and they came up with a feudal system, which was totally unworkable. And it was representative in the end, but they tried so hard to make it like it was in England. And you'll find that the Carolinas became the most hoity-toity. Is that a good history word? They did their best to emulate the nobility in Europe. But by 1700, we began to have rice plantations. And South Carolina is the only colony that was begun with slavery. Slavery was introduced to the other colonies later, but South Carolina was begun with slave labor. They brought slaves over from the islands. And once upon a time, North Carolina and South Carolina were all one, but then North Carolina is so mountainous and so hilly that in 1685, they started referring to the area north of our area as North Carolina, and in 1729, it became a separate colony. North Carolina developed small farms and became a haven for dissenters from anywhere else, because you get up in those mountains, it's hard to find you. Whereas South Carolina plantations were very aristocrats. Like I said, they tried to emulate Europe. The last colony to be formed was Georgia. James Oglethorpe got a grant in 1732, and it became his first colony was Savannah. He tried for years to get the king to let him have a colony, to set up a colony south of Carolina. He finally said, well, it'd be a refuge for poor dissenters in jails, another place to dump your excess population. It's going to create a buffer between South Carolina and Florida, which is the biggest thing they wanted to do. You have a place for protected Protestants in Europe. And, of course, we could convert the Indians. But the biggest selling point was create a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. They first based their economy on silk. They tried growing silkworms and growing grapes for wine. It was not prosperous. You couldn't sell your land. You couldn't have slaves. You couldn't drink. They tried so hard to make it a haven of purity, but it didn't work, and they didn't become prosperous. All they had to do was look north and see what was going on in Rhode Island and Carolinas, and they could see all these prosperous people up there. So finally, in 1751, the king pulls a charter, and it becomes a royal colony. And all the restrictions against the plantations were removed, and restrictions against the slaves were removed. You could sell your plantation, you could buy a plantation, you could have slaves, you could sell other things and grow cotton. So Georgia became a very independent, but she was the last one formed. But now we've left out some colonies. We left out what we call the middle colonies. New York was the former Dutch colony of New Netherlands, and New Netherlands lost the war to England, and basically commercial wars, and England took over the Netherlands. And in 1664, King Charles II granted his brother the land, the Duke of York. Therefore, you no longer had the Netherlands, now you had New York. It was between the Connecticut and Delaware rivers. And New York was the least democratic of all the colonies. If you had to go anywhere, that's the last colony you wanted to go to. They're very autocratic. New Jersey. The Duke of York transferred part of his landholding of New York to others, and the Dutch settlements were already there. But there was very liberal terms to get land in this area, and the English were attracted to area farming. And even now, New Jersey is called the Garden State. In 1674, Quakers purchased part of it, and in 1702, New Jersey becomes a royal colony, and the entire area that we now know as New Jersey was all united. William Penn founded the colony we know as Pennsylvania. It was a philanthropic experiment. He wanted a place for the persecuted Quakers to go because they were persecuted unmercifully, because they were pacifists in Europe. In 1681, they got a grant from the king. The colony was called the Holy Experiment, settled entirely by Quakers. They treated the Indians fairly. They paid them for their land. There was no problems. And they attracted a lot of hard-working German-speaking peoples. I won't say Germans because Germany wasn't really united at that point in time. And there was a lot of different settlers, but they were predominantly German and hard-working. So now you've got Delaware. You'd think it's a southern state, but it didn't. It was originally founded by the Swedes. The Dutch captured it. And then when New Netherlands lost the war, as part of a grant to the Duke of York. 1682, William Penn buys the area from the Duke of York so he'd have access to the sea. In 1702, they could elect their own assembly, but Penn would choose the governor. Now, you've got other colonies. There's Bermuda, St. Christopher, Barbados, Jamaica, and they were all known for growing sugar, but they were colonies, too, of the English. Now, basically, we've got all 13 colonies set. And I guess Wednesday, hopefully, we'll go over the map and make sure that you know where each one of them is located. And like I said, you should know at least one thing about each of the colonies. Now, all the colonies had elected assemblies eventually. 12 bicameral and 1 unicameral. And bicameral is 2 houses. Pennsylvania is the only one that had a 1 house. The elected assemblies could pass acts but the votes in most cases were by the governor or the king. Each colony had its own voting rules. Women, slaves, Indians, indentures, non-Christians, and propertyless individuals could not vote. You had to be a male and own property. Most all of them had some religious requirement. Whatever the religion of that colony was, you had to be a member of that church. But the main requirements were the right religion, you had to own property, and be a white male. Now, there were 3 types of colonies, not locations, types. There's proprietary, corporate, and royal. The proprietary colony is owned by a joint stock company or an individual. In other words, a group of people get together and come up with the money, and they have the charter for the colony. It's proprietary. A corporate colony, the charter for the colony is held by the colony itself, and it's self-governing. Like the colony of Massachusetts Bay, they brought the charter with them. So no one in England could do anything about it because they held the charter in their hands. You only became a royal colony when the king pulled your charter, whether it's proprietary or corporate. The king was still a boss. He could still pull your charter, and he could appoint the governor, and he could make the rules. Each one of the colonies had a governor who was either appointed by the joint stock company, selected in the corporate colonies, or appointed by the royal colony, by the king. But the governor was the chief executive. You had an assembly elected, except in the South. They wasn't always elected in the South. And they had what we call the power of the purse. It's kind of like our lower house of representatives. They're the ones that pass the taxes. And power of the purse simply means they had the power to tax. The council was not elected. It was appointed by the governor, and they were advisors. They were what you call the upper house, like the Senate. They had no legal power, but they were the ones who advised the governor. So you've got proprietary colony, joint stock or individual. You've got corporate colony, charter held by the colony itself, and it was self-governing. You've got a royal colony, where the king pulls your charter. As far as the governing goes, you've got a governor appointed or selected, and he's your chief executive. He's usually the one that has the power of commanding the army, signing the bills or vetoing the bills. I mean, he's the one that's in charge. Your assembly is elected, except in the South, and they have the power of the purse, the power to tax. The council are just basically the advisors and friends of the governor. Now, the colony charters would serve as a constitution, or basically a form of government for the colonies. The one thing you must remember, it's when these people came over here, they came over as Englishmen, and they retained all their rights and privileges they had in England. New England colonies had town meetings. They were much more democratic. The southern colonies, they had sheriffs, justice of the peace, and a parish is a subdivision of the county. I grew up thinking that, New Orleans and Louisiana must be one of the most religious states in the world because they had so many parishes, and being a Catholic, I assumed it was all Catholic, but it's not. It was just a French word for a subdivision of the county, like we have precincts. So you've got middle colonies that had the mixture of both. The middle colonies are New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. The judges in all the colonies are appointed by the governor, which gives them a great deal of power. There are no political powers. The only thing you had was regional interest. I mean, the people in Boston couldn't care 2 hoots and a holler about what's going on in Charleston, and Charleston felt the same way about Boston. Each of them was concerned with only their immediate surroundings. Now, we didn't go through all of these. I mean, we went through the Tudors, and we started on the Stuarts, got to James I, but that's as far as we got. The Tudors are the ones that are in power when we start doing things, and James I is the one who really got settlements going over here. But his son, Charles I, and James II are going to come into being very shortly. Under King James rules, we start seeing settlement in the New World. And they had what they called the Glorious Revolution. King James's son, King Charles I, was overthrown and the only English monarch to ever be beheaded. The revolution, that's what they called revolution over there. It took place over a period of 15 years because King Charles would not go to Parliament to get okay to do taxes. He wanted to be an absolute ruler, and by this time the Parliament has gained so much freedom toward running the country that they would not have it. A man called Oliver Cromwell, who was nothing more than a big farmer, but he had a fantastic ability to lead men in the fights, and he led armies against the king and won, and he made himself ruler for 15 years. He called himself the Protectorate. Well, after 15 years, he died, and his son took over and tried to run it, but by this time, the Parliament and everybody else, they're looking around, and they're the only country, as far as they know, in the world who doesn't have a king or a monarch of some kind. So they decide we need to have a bloodline. Go back to the bloodline of King Charles, who we overthrew, and invite his brother to come over. Well, James was invited to come over, but now he's been living, for about 30 years in France. He's become very Catholic. He's got a Catholic wife. He wants to be an absolute ruler. He's not getting along with anybody. So the Parliament again says, you know, we can't have this. Cannot have it. So they're going to invite the children of King Charles I, Mary, his daughter, who's Protestant, to come back over. Well, Mary will only come over and become queen if she can bring her husband, William of Orange. So William and Mary of Orange, and they're all of the direct bloodline back to King Henry VIII, take the throne, and the Parliament puts even more restrictions on. Now Parliament names a successor, not the king or queen. No Catholic will ever become king or queen of England. Well, Mary dies, and William goes into a state of mourning, and he dies very shortly thereafter, being thrown from a horse. And then Mary's sister Anne becomes queen. They're all directly related in the bloodline of Henry VIII. Anne, well, they called her Queen Mum. She had 13 children, and none of them lived. Her husband was dead. She was well happy to, wear the crown and be the queen and not do anything. She let Parliament run the country, and Parliament loved that. But then Queen Anne dies. Now we've got no more bloodlines to Henry VIII alive in this country. There are people who are related, distant children, but they are German. And then we get into the Georges, and then you have 3 King Georges, and you get to 1776, and King George III is on the throne when we have the revolution. This is all the colonies. We'll go over this in class, or I'll make sure that you know all the colonies and the Great Lakes. Okay, now before we get into these little YouTubes, I think each one of them is about 10 minutes, and it's basically a review of what I've told you, but from a different point of view. And believe me, Mr. Green talks faster than I do. He has a very strange sense of humor. But if you've got your lecture words out, you've got in front of you, you've got governor/council/assembly. So the governor is the chief executive. The council is not elected. It's his friends. It's appointed by him. The assembly is elected. You've got joint stock and proprietorship, corporate, and royal. Those are the 3 types of colonies. A royal colony never starts out as a royal colony. A corporate colony, they have their own charter and their own rules, whereas a joint stock or proprietorship is the people own it and live in a faraway place. Power of the purse is what the assembly has. They have the power to tax. Oligarchy means when the government is run by a rich few. Theocracy is when the government is run by church people. Aristocrats, now this, we don't have any royal aristocrats. In this country, an aristocrat is just someone who's educated and wealthy. The indenture system is when you sell your soul or your labor for 5 to 7 years or even 10 years for passage to the New World. The Religious Toleration Act was an act passed in Maryland so that the minority Catholics would be protected, and you could have freedom of religion as long as you believed in the Holy Trinity. The Mayflower Compact is not the first Constitution. It's simply a document agreeing to self-rule. The Great Migration is between 1630 and 1640, when the Puritans migrated by the tens of thousands out of England. New England, They survived longer in New England than they did in the South because of natural increase. They're healthier. They've got their weather there is so much colder it kills a lot of the germs, so they didn't have as many diseases. Very high life expectancy. You had children in New England that would grow up and knew their grandparents, where very few of them even knew their own parents in the South, especially around Jamestown. It's strong family ties. Those last two words, declension, that simply means you're leaving the faith of the Puritanism, the congressional doctrine. The slavery, we're not going to do that this semester. Not this semester. We're not going to do it this chapter. We'll get into slavery in the next chapter. So, like I said, you heard all these words, and I want to remind you, Bradford was the governor of Plymouth, where you got the Pilgrims. Winthrop as governor of Boston, or the Massachusetts Bay, where you've got the Puritans. And the Pilgrims and the Puritans were both Congressionalists, but the Puritans wanted to purify, and the Pilgrims wanted to separate. So the Pilgrims were separatist, the Puritans were non-separatist. Each one of these, I think, is about 10 minutes, and although it says Thanksgiving, I think he says about 2 words of Thanksgiving. If you want, what you can do is take a break and come back, but I do want you to watch these, because the repetition of seeing the PowerPoint, me going over the words, and then watching this, you're going to remember it. So here goes. My computer works a lot better than the one at school. Hopefully, that is. With a little finger shaking, I think that means it's getting ready to do something. Have to be bragging on it. It's going to not come up. There we go. I was wrong. That computer's not working that much better than the one at school, is it? Here we go. Hopefully.
I was always the person that people came to for help. After my heart attack, I relied on my friends and family so much. If you're here to someone who has had a heart attack, if you've had heart patients, you show is so important. They literally have poured my out. Rebuilding a relationship with your heart is...
What the hey was that?
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to tell the
I have no idea what's going on.
story of how a group of plucky English people struck a blow for religious freedom and founded the greatest, freest, and fattest nation the world has ever seen. These Brits entered a barren land containing... Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to tell in Star Trek, and we all lived happily ever after.
Mr. Green, if it's really that simple, I'm so greatest,
in this class. Freest, and fattest nation the world... So most Americans grow up hearing that the United States was founded by pasty...
My apologies. I know what I did. I hit my hit my clicker too many times. Okay.
English people who came here to escape religious persecution. And that's true of the small proportion of people who settled in the Massachusetts Bay and created what we now know as New England. But these Pilgrims and Puritans, there's a difference, weren't the first people or even the first Europeans to come to the only part of the globe we didn't paint over. In fact, they weren't even the first English people. The first English people came to Virginia. Off topic, but how weird is it that the first permanent English colony in the Americas was named not for Queen Elizabeth's epicness, but for her supposed chastity? Right, anyway, those first English settlers weren't looking for religious freedom, they wanted to get rich. So the first successful English colony in America was founded at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. I say successful because there were 2 previous attempts to colonize the region. They were both epic failures, the more famous of which was the colony at Roanoke Island set up by Sir Walter Raleigh, which is famous because all the colonists disappeared, leaving only the word Croatan carved into a tree. Jamestown was a project of the Virginia Company, which existed to make money for its investors, something it never did. The hope was that they would find gold in the Chesapeake region like the Spanish Spanish had in South America, so there were a disproportionate number of goldsmiths and jewelers there to fancy up that gold, which of course did not exist. Anyway, it turns out that jewelers dislike farming, so much so that Captain John Smith, who soon took over control of the island, once said that they would rather starve than farm. So in the first year, half of the colonists died. 400 replacements came, but by 1610, after a gruesome winter called the Starving Time, the number of colonists had dwindled to 65. And eventually word got out that the New World's one-year survival rate was like 20%, and it became harder to find new colonists. But in 1618, the Virginia Company hit upon a recruiting strategy called the headright system, which offered 50 acres of land for each person that a settler paid to bring over. And this enabled the creation of a number of large estates, which were mostly worked on and populated by indentured servants. Indentured servants weren't quite slaves, but they were kind of temporary slaves, like they could be bought and sold, and they had to do what their masters commanded. But after 7 to 10 years of that, if they weren't dead, they were paid their freedom dues, which they hoped would allow them to buy farms of their own. Sometimes that worked out, but often either the money wasn't enough to buy a farm or else they were too dead to collect it. Even more ominously, in 1619, just 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, the first shipment of African slaves arrived in Virginia. So the colony probably would have continued to struggle along if they hadn't found something that people really loved. Tobacco. Tobacco had been grown in Mexico since at least 1000 BCE, but the Europeans had never seen it, and it proved to be kind of a thank you for the smallpox, here's some lung cancer gift from the natives. Interestingly, King James hated smoking. He called it a custom loathsome to the eye and hateful to the nose, but he loved him some tax revenue, and nothing sells like drugs. By 1624, Virginia was producing more than 200,000 pounds of tobacco per year. By the 1680s, more than 30 million pounds per year. Tobacco was so profitable that colonists created huge plantations with very little in the way of towns or infrastructure to hold the social order together, a strategy that always works out brilliantly. The industry also structured Virginian society. First off, most of the people who came in the 17th century, 3/4 of them, were servants. So Virginia became a microcosm of England, a small class of wealthy landowners sitting atop a mass of servants. That sounds kind of dirty, but it was mostly just sad. The society was also overwhelmingly male, because male servants were more useful in the tobacco fields. They were the greatest proportion of immigrants. In fact, they outnumbered women 5 to 1. The women who did come over were mostly indentured servants, and if they were to marry, which they often did because they were in great demand, they had to wait until their term of service was up. This meant delayed marriage, which meant fewer children, which further reduced the number of females. Life was pretty tough for these women, but on the upside, Virginia was kind of a swamp of pestilence, so their husbands often died. And that created a small class of widows or even unmarried women who, because of their special status, could make contracts and own property, so that was good, sort of. Okay, a quick word about Maryland. Maryland was the second Chesapeake colony, founded in 1632, and by now there was no messing around with joint stock companies. Maryland was a proprietorship, a massive land grant to a single individual named Cecilius Calvert. Calvert wanted to turn Maryland into like a medieval feudal kingdom to benefit himself and his family, and he was no fan of the representational institutions that were developing in Virginia. Also, Calvert was Catholic, and Catholics were welcome in Maryland, which wasn't always the case elsewhere. Speaking of which, let's talk about Massachusetts. So Jamestown might have been the first English colony, but Massachusetts Bay is probably better known. This is largely because the colonists who came there were so recognizable for their beliefs, and also for their hats. That's right, I'm talking about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And no, I will not be talking about Thanksgiving. Is a lie. I can't help myself, but only to clear up the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans, and also to talk about Squanto. God, I love me some Squanto. Let's go to the thought bubble. Most of the English men and women who settled in New England were uber-Protestant Puritans who believed the Protestant Church of England was still too Catholic-y with its kneeling and incense and extravagantly hatted archbishops. The particular Puritans, who by the way did not call themselves that, other people did, who settled in New England were called Congregationalists because they thought congregations should determine leadership and worship structures, not bishops. The Pilgrims were even more extreme. They wanted to separate more or less completely from the Church of England. So first they fled to the Netherlands, but the Dutch were apparently too corrupt for them, so they rounded up investors and financed a new colony in 1620. They were supposed to land in Virginia, but in what perhaps should have been taken as an omen, they were blown wildly off course and ended up in what's now Massachusetts, founding a colony called Plymouth. While still on board their ship, the Mayflower, 41 of the 150 or so colonists wrote and signed an agreement called the Mayflower Compact, in which they all bound themselves to follow, quote, just and equal laws that their chosen representatives would write up. Since this was the first written framework for government in the U.S., it's kind of a big deal. But anyway, the Pilgrims had the excellent fortune of landing in Massachusetts with 6 weeks before winter, and they had the good sense not to bring very much food with them or any farm animals. Half of them died before winter was out. The only reason they didn't all die by was that local Indians, led by Squanto, gave them food and saved them. A year later, grateful that they had survived mainly due to the help of an alliance with the local chief Massasoit, and because the Indians had taught them how to plant corn and where to catch fish, the Pilgrims held a big feast, the first Thanksgiving. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And by the way, that feast was on the fourth Thursday in November, not mid-October, as is celebrated in some of these green areas we call not America. Anyway, Squanto was a pretty amazing character, and not only because he helped save the Pilgrims. He found that almost all of his tribe, the Patuxet, had been wiped out by disease, and eventually settled with the Pilgrims on the site of his former village, and then died of disease, because it is always ruining everything. So the Pilgrims struggled on until 1691, when their colony was subsumed by the larger and much more successful Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was chartered in 1629 by London merchants who, like the founders of the Virginia Company, hoped to make money. But unlike Virginia, the board of directors relocated from England to America, which meant that in Massachusetts they had a greater degree of autonomy and self-government than they did in Virginia. Social unity was also much more important in Massachusetts than it was in Virginia. The Puritans' religious mission meant that the common good was, at least at first, put above the needs or the rights of the individual. Those different ideas in the North and South about the role of government would continue until now. Oh God, it's time for the mystery document? The rules are simple. I read the mystery document, which I have not seen before. If I get it right, then I do not get shocked with this shock pen. If I get it wrong, I do. All right. We must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities. Superfluities? I don't know. For the supply of others' necessities, we must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. All right, first thing I noticed, the author of this document is a terrible speller, or possibly wrote this before English was standardized. Also, pretty religious individual. And the community in question seems to embrace something near socialism, abridging the superfluous for others' necessities. Also, it says that the community should be like a city upon a hill, like a model for everybody. And because of that metaphor, I know exactly where it comes from, the sermon, A Model of Christian Charity by John Winthrop. Yes! Yes! No punishment! This is one of the most important sermons in American history. It shows us just how religious the Puritans were, but it also shows us that their religious mission wasn't really one of individualism, but of collective effort. In other words, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one. But this city on a hill metaphor is the basis for one kind of American exceptionalism, the idea that we are so special and so godly that we will be a model to other nations. At least as long, according to Winthrop, as we act together. Lest you think Winthrop's words were forgotten, they did become the centerpiece of Ronald Reagan's 1989 farewell address. Okay, so New England towns were governed democratically, but that doesn't mean that the Puritans were big on equality or that everybody was able to participate in government, because no. The only people who could vote or hold office were church members, and to be a full church member, you had to be a, quote, visible saint. So really, power stayed in the hands of the church elite. The same went for equality. While it was better than in the Chesapeake colonies or England, as equality went pretty unequal. As John Winthrop declared, some must be rich and some poor. Some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Or as historian Eric Foner put it, inequality was considered an expression of God's will, and while some liberties applied to all inhabitants, there were separate lists of rights for freemen, women, children, and servants. There was also slavery in Massachusetts. The first slaves were recorded in the colony in 1640. However, Puritans really did foster equality in one sense. They wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. In fact, parents could be punished by the town councils for not properly instructing their children and making them literate. But when Roger Williams called for citizens to be able to practice any religion they chose, he was banished from the colony. So was Anne Hutchinson, who argued that church membership should be based on inner grace and not on outward manifestations like church attendance. Williams went on to found Rhode Island, so that worked out fine for him. But Hutchinson, who was doubly threatening to Massachusetts because she was a woman preaching unorthodox ideas, was too radical and was further banished to Westchester, New York, where she and her family were killed settled by Indians. Finally, someone who doesn't die of disease or starvation. So Americans like to think of their country as being founded by pioneers of religious freedom who were seeking liberty from the oppressive English. But we've already seen that's only partly true. For one thing, Puritan ideas of equality and representation weren't particularly equitable or representational. In truth, America was also founded by indigenous people and by Spanish settlers, and the earliest English colonies weren't about religion, they were about money. We'll see this tension between American mythology and American history again next week, and also every week. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Banco. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. The show is...
Let's see if we have any better luck with this one. And I do apologize. I'll be very patient and just hit my mouse one time. I guess patience is its own reward.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to cram 150 years of American history into one video. Why? Well, many American history classes don't cover the colonial period at all because most major American history tests have like one question about it. Mr. Green, so this isn't going to be on the test? That's awesome, because I have some flirtatious notes to exchange with Jessica Alvarez. Yeah, me from the past. So listen, would you rather do well on one test or lead a richer, more productive life as a result of having a better understanding of the complicated factors that led to the creation of the greatest nation in history? Stan, can I get a libertage? So listen up, me from the past. It's time to bask in our own greatness. And by greatness, I mean morally dubious dominance over people who would have been just fine without us. So contrary to popular mythology, colonial America was more than just Jamestown in Massachusetts. There was, for instance, New Amsterdam. The tale goes the Dutch traders bought the island of Manhattan from Lenape Indians for $24 in 1624. That isn't quite true, but it contains a truth. The Dutch traders who founded their colony were businessmen, and New Amsterdam was above everything else a commercial venture. This is still true in New York, actually. I mean, Manhattan is all about Wall Street. In fact, Crash Course writer and history teacher Raoul Meyer is believed to be the last person living on the island of Manhattan who does not work for an investment bank. So the Dutch let anyone into New Amsterdam who could help them turn a profit, including Jews and even Quakers, but they didn't like Indians very much. In fact, they drove them out of the colony. But anyway, the $24 the Lenape supposedly got for New England was $24 more than the Dutch got when the English took over the colony in 1664 by sailing 4 frigates into the harbor and asking for the colony in a threatening voice. So New Amsterdam became New York, which was a mixed blessing. The population doubled in the decade after the English takeover, but English rule meant less economic freedom for women who, under the Dutch, were able to inherit property and conduct business for themselves, and under the English, free black people lost a lot of the jobs they'd been able to hold under the Dutch. Things were better in Pennsylvania, so much so that it was known as the best poor man's country, which admittedly in the 17th century was a low bar to jump over. Given by Charles II to this guy, William Penn, in 1681, Pennsylvania was a huge tract of land round about here. The land included contemporary Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey, but we made an editorial decision not to talk about New Jersey here on Crash Course due to my long-standing anti-New Jersey bias. So Penn wanted his colony to be a haven for Quakers because he was a Quaker, as you know if you've ever seen a container of Quaker oats. Quakers were a pretty tolerant bunch, except when it came to slavery, which they opposed vehemently. And under Penn's leadership, the colony showed remarkable religious toleration and also an amazing respect for Indian communities. But then, after Penn was gone, yeah, the usual. In 1737, Pennsylvania colonists perpetrated one of the most famous frauds of colonial America, the walking purchase. Indians agreed to cede a tract of land bounded by the distance a man could walk in 36 hours, but the clever governor James Logan hired a bunch of fast runners who marked out territory much larger than the Indians anticipated. Quakers had to resort to such tricks because they were pacifists. I should also mention that they weren't particularly fond of loose living. The government prevented swearing and drunkenness, for instance, but you know, it was still pretty great compared to the other colonies. More than half of the male population was eligible to vote, and Pennsylvania's dual promise of religious freedom and cheap land attracted a lot of German immigrants. Well, I should say German-speaking immigrants. States. There was, of course, not a Germany at the time, as many viewers of Crash Course World History have pointed out to me. And now let us venture south, where we will find many mosquito-borne illnesses and somewhat less abolitionist sentiments. In 1663, English King Charles II gave 8 proprietors the right to set up a colony just north of the Spanish-controlled Florida to serve as a buffer. This became South Carolina, and its original settlers came from the sugar colony of Barbados, which helps to explain why they were so awesome at slavery. They tried to enslave the Indians and ship them to the Caribbean, but when that didn't work out, they began to import African slaves. We're going to talk a lot more about slavery in future episodes, but for now, just bear in mind it sucked. Okay, so in the last quarter of the 17th century, the British colonies in the Americas experienced a series of crises. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the document, I get it right, no shock, I get it wrong, shock. Okay, we accuse Sir William Berkeley as guilty of each and every one of the same, and as one who has traitorously attempted, violated, and injured His Majesty's interests here by a loss of a great part of his colony and many of his faithful, loyal subjects, by him betrayed and in a barbarous and shameful manner exposed to the incursions and murder of the heathen. And we do further declare these ensuing persons in this list to have been his wicked and pernicious counselors. Both wicked and pernicious, those are some terrible counselors. Okay, so this guy clearly hated William Berkeley, who I happen to know was governor of Virginia. Particularly upset about the colonists being incurred upon and murdered by the heathen, that is, the Native Americans. I mean, I have a guess, but I'm not brimming with confidence. The one person I know who hated William Berkeley was Nathaniel Bacon. Yes! Yes, yes! No shock for me and no pleasure for you, you schadenfreude Crash Course viewers. So Nathaniel Bacon arrived in Virginia in 1673 and led an armed uprising against Governor Berkeley just 3 years later. And just to be clear, he was mad not because Berkeley did a poor job protecting colonists from Indians, but because Berkeley wouldn't allow them to kill more Indians and take more land. Berkeley had already given all the really good land to his cronies, those aforementioned wicked and pernicious counselors, leaving men like Bacon with serious beef. I hate myself. Before the rebellion was quelled by the arrival of English warships, Bacon burned Jamestown and made himself ruler of Virginia and looted Berkeley's supporters' land. 23 of the rebels were hanged, but not Bacon, who died shortly after taking control from, you guessed it, dysentery. Dang it, dysentery! It's called history, not dysentery-story. Bacon's rebellion is sometimes portrayed as an early example of lower-class artisans and would-be farmers rising up against the corrupt British elite, which I guess kind of. But the biggest effects of the rebellion were 1, a shift away from indentured servants to slaves, and 2, a general desire by the English crown to control the colonies more. Okay, so in 1686, King James II really tried to put the hammer down by consolidating Connecticut, Plymouth, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, and East and West Jersey into one big mega colony called the Dominion of New England. Its near-dictatorial ruler was former New York Governor Edmund Andros, who proceeded to appoint his own officials and lay his own taxes without even consulting any of the elected assemblies. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on your perspective, a major event in British history reversed this policy, the Glorious Revolution. Now, thankfully, this isn't Crash Course British history, or it would quickly turn into Crash Course John is bored history. But the upshot is that Britain got a fancy new royal family from Holland, which sparked uprisings in the colonies, and Andros was thrown into a Boston jail as the colonies reasserted their independence. And these new guys imposed the English Toleration Act of 1690, which decreed that all Protestants could worship freely. As Toleration Acts go, this one wasn't that tolerant. I mean, it still discriminated against Jews, but it did mark the end of the Puritan experiment. No longer would membership in a Congregationalist church be a requirement for voting in general court elections. Property ownership would now be the determining factor. And Massachusetts would now have a governor from England, not from a company board residing inside the colony itself. This was the context for one of the most talked about events in colonial history, the Salem witch trials. A lot of ink has been expended on this incident, and the interpretations of it are numerous and controversial, so I'm just going to point out that when the witch trials, which claimed the lives of 14 of the nearly 150 women and men accused of witchcraft, happened in 1691, New England as a colony had basically just failed in its religious mission. The Tolerance Act meant that people in Massachusetts would have to accept even Quakers as virtual equals. Quakers! So it's not surprising that colonists would look for scapegoats or that their male leaders would seek to reassert their gender dominance. Okay, to talk about colonial American economics, let's go to the thought bubble. Most colonists were farmers or worked on farms, and they were mostly small, unlike the giant plantations that predominated in the Caribbean. Since New England contains relatively little in the way of tropical diseases and was increasingly free of Native Americans, the colonial population there skyrocketed so fast that families began to run out of land, so those second and third sons increasingly had to go make their way in growing coastal cities. We'll talk about this more in future episodes, but for now, let's just note the idea of a person owning a small farm and the idea of freedom are pretty closely intertwined in the early part of American history. It's more of an amber waves of grain place than a behold this metropolis place. In fact, they were richer than any other colonial elites. Were they rich enough to dominate the Constitutional Convention? Time will tell. Now, not everyone was a farmer or a slave. There were growing numbers of artisans in the colonies. Although British colonial policy discouraged local manufacturing, the growing population in America meant that there was certain to be a market for locally produced goods, especially clothing and metalwork. Remember, one of the heroes of the American Revolution, Paul Revere, was a silversmith. Thanks, Thought Level. So that variety of jobs leads us nicely to our last topic today, colonial society. Although Americans like to think of themselves as classless, pun intended, that's not really the case. I mean, the colonies definitely had an elite ruling class, especially in the South, that did what it could to perpetuate itself. George Washington's father and grandfather were both justices of the peace, an important role in colonial times, meaning that George Washington had deeply elite roots. So that was the top of colonial society, and at the bottom was a growing number of poor people. While it's never good to be poor, it was much better to be poor in the colonies than it was in England or much of the rest of Europe, which is why people kept indenturing themselves to get here. America had lots of food, and there was the possibility of maybe someday getting some land, provided you didn't die of dysentery, oh, and also provided you weren't a woman. Married women in 18th century colonial America generally couldn't own property, and husbands usually willed their land to their sons and their personal items to their daughters, meaning that almost all landowners were male. In the earliest days of colonization, when everyone was needed to ensure the survival of the colonies, women had a greater role in the economy, although they were still expected to be wives and mothers above all else. Male dominance was written into law and solidified in practice. Women's work was mostly confined to the home, and especially for lower-class women, it involved a lot of drudgery. As one woman, Mary Cooper, wrote in her diary in 1769, "I am dirty and distressed, almost wearied to death. This day is 40 years since I left my father's house and come here, and here have I seen little else but hard labor and sorrow." And that's actually a good place to end, because it reminds us that history is about much more than the lives of kings like James II and rebels like Nathaniel Bacon. And while history classes and exams tend to focus on those kinds of men, and they were mostly men, the real story of history is about regular people trying to take care of their families and not die. The colonial era often gets skipped for its lack of large-scale drama, but those small-scale dramas can be found in abundance. Next week, we'll go back to all that great men and dramatic events crap when we start talking about the American Revolution. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Mower. Our script supervisor is Meredith.
Well, we're not going to get to the revolution quite that quickly. Two notes. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a man called Daniel Boone, who was known as quite a big frontiersman. He was from Pennsylvania. He went from Pennsylvania to North Carolina, then down into South Carolina and Kentucky. He was also a Pennsylvania Quaker. So he was a pacifist too, even though he was noted for being a great hunter. The only other thing I wanted to mention, that's just FYI, it has nothing to do with any of your history things. We'll go over the map and make sure you know where all the colonies are located, make sure that you do know something about each one of them. And the division between northern, middle, and southern colonies, you do need to know that. Hope you enjoyed your weekend. Don't do too much playing and having too much fun.